Charles M. Schulz was rejected by Disney twice. Now, no comic or comic artist have been as successful as Charles M. Schulz and his iconic Peanuts strip and characters. Charlie Brown, Lucy, Snoopy, especially Snoopy, they're known and beloved the world over. But all that success didn't come overnight. Schulz faced years of rejection from publicists, from newspapers, from a school yearbook, and from the subject of today's video, the Walt Disney Studios. This is a fact about Schulz's development as an artist that a lot of people aren't really aware of, but I figured it's a story worth telling, especially for anyone trying to break into the comics or animation industry, or just trying to break into any world or field to find any kind of solace or relatability in. Because in the face of rejection, Schulz didn't just throw in the towel and pivot. He persevered and honed his craft and kept trying and networking and was able to build a comic empire out of pen and ink. But he was rejected by Disney twice, so let's get into it. Schulz was born in 1922 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was nicknamed Sparky after a comic character. His father was a barber, he struggled in school, he struggled at baseball, he struggled at socializing, and he had a strange dog named Spike.
Yes, sir? What can I do for you?
Schulz loved dogs all throughout his life, and in fact it was his fascination and love for his strange dog Spike that led to his very first published appearance. A sketch of Spike that Sparky had done appeared in a Ripley's Believe It or Not publication upon mailing it in. Sparky escaped into his drawings. They were a great outlet considering how socially awkward and shy around his peers he was. He was able to express himself this way. That's not to say the world was ready to embrace him back. His drawings were notably rejected from appearing in his high school yearbook. But Schulz was very serious about art, and he kept pursuing it. After high school, he would continue his education at Art Instruction Inc., a Minneapolis-based art school. Schulz never talked much about Disney throughout his career, but to understand his and other artists' aspirations for Disney, one must first understand the Walt Disney Studios of the time. While still a relatively new studio, the Walt Disney Studios were known around the world by the 1930s. Mickey Mouse was already a household name and a beloved figure. And as Walt Disney kept pushing the medium and art of animation to its limits of seeing what he could do to up the ante of anatomical accuracy and disciplined motion and emotion in drawings and classical drawing and character animation, the ante of expectations was never higher, especially in the lead up to his masterpiece, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Walt Disney wasn't just making cartoons anymore. He had the theatrical shorts, but Walt had high art feature film ambitions, and the standards were never higher. I'm curious to know where Schulz got the idea to submit to Disney, because there were plenty of other animation studios in the 1930s, at the Fleischer Studios and Warner Brothers. Disney, of course, is the biggest and the best known, and I kind of find it funny that it still is today. I work in animation, and when I graduated college trying to get a job, I applied to a million Disney jobs and always wanted to work there. And when I couldn't find work, a well-meaning old family friend suggested to me, "Why don't you work for Disney?" And I'm like, why didn't I think of that? Of course, yeah. So it's comforting to know that all of us have been there. Maybe Schulz got a similar suggestion. I also just want to clarify, it's kind of assumed that it was a lot easier to get a job in animation back in the rubber hose, black and white, classic cartoon days, but the truth is it was always competitive. And there were always a million artists in the country that were the best in their hometown trying to get into the big leagues. And Sparky Schulz from Minneapolis was one of them, so as a young man in the 1930s, Charles M. Schulz submitted his drawings to the Walt Disney Studios for consideration. I'm going to stop calling him Sparky at this point because he's a grown man and I don't know him. Schulz submitted his drawings. He was rejected. Schulz tried again. He was rejected. Then the war happened. I joke around, but artists are used to rejection, but Schulz did have bigger problems at the time. He had lost his mother and he was drafted as a soldier into World War II. As a staff sergeant and cadet, though, Schulz did not stop drawing. He kept up with his craft, portraying their lives in the barracks and training on the battlefield on his friends' envelopes that they would send back home. Upon returning home from the war and still unable to find work as an artist, Schulz would return to Art Instruction Inc., this time as a teacher. And it was here, now that he had a disposable income, relatively, that he was able to pursue being a comic artist full-time. Over time, and with much effort, Schulz's drawings, illustrations, and comics began to appear in books, magazines, newspapers, and advertisements. Schulz just had such a knack of capturing the mess and embarrassment and joy and sorrow, not just of adolescence, but of human life, in very simple drawings. And this lean into the way children see the world is what he would lean into fully. Play to your strengths, they say. And it worked. His new comic about children and their sometimes profound, sometimes not, thoughts and feelings was called Lil Folks, and it was a hit. It would appear in newspapers and magazines, but once picked up by United Features Syndicate, it would not only get widespread release, but it would also take on its final name, Peanuts, named for the Peanut Gallery. And from this widespread syndication, Peanuts and Peanuts Mania would grow and grow and grow. It would eventually appear in over 2,600 newspapers. It would amass 355 million readers, 75 countries. It'd have all the TV specials, merchandise, Christmas time, all that. And by the 20th century's end, Peanuts was the biggest comic of all time. Did Charles Schulz hold any ill will for being rejected by Disney? It's not really known, though at the time I'm certain that he did. Regardless, his characters would go on to become as influential and iconic as Disney's characters. I'd argue that currently Snoopy has more of a stranglehold of the public consciousness than Mickey Mouse himself does. If Schulz had fulfilled his goal of becoming an animator at Disney, what would have happened to him? Would he have become one of the great Disney animators, or would he have just been another in-betweener, a cog, like his future collaborator Bill Melendez? Well, in truth, I think that drawing in that complex, classical Disney style that they were going for was a bit of a departure for Schulz and his comic sensibilities, but you can train to do anything. You can change the way you draw. As long as you have the discipline for it, you can do it. At the end of the day, Walt Disney and Charles M. Schulz, two titans of American cartooning, I think both artists are beloved for different reasons, for different philosophies. Walt Disney was an idealist. His movies and stories present the real dangers and harsh realities of the world, but in the end, they always have an injection of sugar, warmth, whimsy, and frivolity. You know, Walt's stories always end with the best possible outcome. I think particularly of the Disney adaptation of The Ant and the Grasshopper, which is one of their old theatrical shorts from way back. It's based on the Aesop fable where the hardworking ant refuses food and shelter to the frivolous grasshopper when the harsh winter comes. The Disney version ends with the ants welcoming the grasshopper in with open arms to perform music and song in return for food and shelter. Now that is a Walt Disney best possible outcome ending. Schulz, in contrast, was a realist. I refrain from calling him a cynic. He had cynical characters, but so did Walt occasionally. Schulz had a far more grounded view and delivery and perception of the world. You can see that in the tone of his comics, not just in Peanuts, but in Lil Folks, Hegmire, Teenagers Unite. Side note, I love Teenagers Unite. Schulz presented the day today as it is.
You've been dumb before, Charlie Brown, but this time you really did it.
Charlie Brown is berated constantly, but through that, Schulz recognizes that there's a solace in heartbreak, an understanding in disappointment, a beauty in the unknown. Schulz was certainly a man of faith, but he was also a very curious man, very thoughtful. Linus is always quoting philosophers and great thinkers. Everything, even sorrow, is played for laughs, ultimately, in Peanuts. It's hard to watch Charlie Brown fail so much to kick the football, but it's funny. Walt and Schulz's worlds are just very visually disparate as well. Walt kept striving for more. He wanted his films to be like classical, baroque, moving paintings, but to Schulz, less was always more. The comics were just a pen, a black ink pen, and he was never tricky with the shots or the way it was framed. Disney was classical. Schulz was Vince Guaraldi. If Walt Disney had his way, Charlie Brown eventually would have kicked that football. Schulz would never. The world is hard on its artists. Everyone always reveres the classics and scorns the new. It's always been that way. Art is expensive. Entertainment's expensive. That's what makes any breakthrough so impressive. A real artistic breakthrough. As of this upload date, we have more resources than ever to make a name for ourselves as artists, but the entry is so much harder to break through. I've gotten to work at Disney, it's been wonderful, and I'm hoping it can happen again. Breaking into animation or cartooning now, it almost feels oversaturated at this point. Especially for new talent, it's hard to just enter the industry. But in a world that's so hard on its artists, I think it's wonderful that a great talent like Schulz got to create his work how he liked it and end it on his own terms. That a man like Schulz did not let multiple rejections from the biggest and greatest cartoon studio around get him down. And he was still able to make his fortune and make a name for himself and impact so many people. This field's a lot more competitive than it was in the 1930s, and newspaper comics are almost impossible to break into. Perhaps now Schulz would have been just another one of those content creators, pushing and staying consistent with it, like so many of us. Thank you very much for watching. A huge shout out to my patrons, Jib the Snib, Snake Eyes. Okay, I don't have any paid patrons yet, but when I do, this is how they'll appear. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, the link is in the bio. Expect more content like this from me. It was fun to make and fun to watch, so please, if you haven't already, subscribe, like, leave a comment, and thanks for watching.